What started with a single quirky garden gnome quickly exploded into one of the wildest HOA battles ever caught on camera. When Harold, a proud black homeowner in a quiet suburban neighborhood, placed a few cheerful gnomes on his lawn, he thought it would simply bring joy to his yard. But the HOA didn't see it that way. They claimed his decorations violated community standards and demanded their removal. Harold refused, and that's when the real drama began. Each night, more gnomes mysteriously appeared, multiplying across lawns like a playful rebellion. Neighbors joined in, turning the subdivision into a surreal battlefield of hundreds of gnomes standing shoulder to shoulder in defiance. What followed was a clash of wills, furious HOA board members, determined residents, national news attention, and a courtroom showdown. This is the unbelievable tale of how a lawn full of gnomes turned into a movement no one could stop. In a quiet black suburb on the edge of Atlanta, where the manicured lawns seemed to say more about a person's reputation than their smile, lived Mr. Harold Carter. Harold was a retired postal worker, a widower in his late 60s, who found joy in small, simple things. His greatest pride wasn't his two-story brick home, nor the gleaming Cadillac he polished every Sunday, but rather the whimsical little army of garden gnomes that decorated his front yard. Each gnome had a personality. There was the fisherman with his crooked hat, the one pushing a wheelbarrow full of fake cabbages, and a set of twins holding lanterns that glowed faintly at night. Harold had started with just one, a gift from his granddaughter, but soon it became a collection, 20 gnomes standing proudly in his front garden, adding color and character to a street lined with identical beige lawns. Neighbors often chuckled when they walked past. Some kids pointed and laughed. Others said it reminded them of something out of a fairy tale. But Harold didn't mind the jokes. His gnomes brought him peace, a sense of cheer in the silence that filled his home since his wife's passing. They stood as guardians of his memories, each one representing a little spark of joy. But peace rarely lasts long in a neighborhood ruled by a strict HOA. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly inside an envelope stamped with the Homeowners Association seal. Harold found it tucked between his water bill and grocery flyers. At first, he thought it was just another reminder about trash bins or lawn maintenance. But when he opened it, the words cut deeper than expected. Your garden gnomes are in violation of community standards. Remove them within 10 days, or face daily fines. Harold read it twice, then 3 times. His heart sank. How could tiny statues be such a problem? They weren't noisy, they weren't dangerous, and they certainly weren't hurting anyone. But the HOA didn't see charm. They saw disorder, something that clashed with their vision of uniform beauty. By that evening, Harold sat on his porch, staring out at his gnomes with a heavy heart. Each one suddenly looked less like a friend and more like a liability. He thought about removing them himself, avoiding the fight, avoiding the expense. But deep down, something in him resisted. Why should he erase the little joy he had left just to satisfy people who only saw the world in terms of rules and violations? The neighborhood had seen plenty of HOA battles before. There were disputes over mailbox colors, arguments about the length of grass, and even a family who was forced to repaint their house 3 different times. But this felt personal. The gnomes weren't just lawn ornaments. They were Harold's identity, his rebellion against the sameness that smothered the street. The next few days brought whispers. Some neighbors shook their heads in sympathy, others shrugged, saying, "You know how the HOA is." But one thing became clear. People noticed. A couple of kids even slipped notes into Harold's mailbox saying how much they loved the gnomes, begging him not to take them down. It warmed him, but the threat of fines loomed heavy. On the 10th day, Harold woke early. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow over the rows of identical homes. He shuffled outside in his slippers, prepared to make a decision. But what he saw stopped him in his tracks. There, in the middle of his yard, stood a brand new gnome he didn't recognize. This one was holding a tiny trumpet, its cheeks puffed out in a frozen note. Harold's jaw dropped. He hadn't bought it, and no one had asked his permission. Yet here it was, standing tall beside his fisherman. Confused, he looked around, half expecting to see a prankster hiding in the bushes. But the street was quiet. Still, he couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling up his spine. Someone had sided with him, someone had chosen to fight back. Not with angry words or legal papers, but with another gnome. The next morning, there were two more. One holding a shovel, another riding a tiny ceramic turtle. By the third morning, Harold's yard had grown from 21 to 25. It was as though an invisible army was assembling in the dead of night, each soldier small but defiant. Neighbors began to notice, and curiosity bloomed into gossip. "Did you see Carter's yard?" they whispered. "Those gnomes are multiplying." Some laughed, others frowned, but all eyes turned toward Harold's lawn, which was quickly transforming into something surreal. The HOA wasn't laughing. By the end of the week, Harold received another letter, sharper than the first: "Remove all garden gnomes immediately, or legal action will follow." But it was too late. The secret rebellion had taken root. And Harold wasn't alone anymore. Each night, unseen hands crept through the darkness, planting more gnomes like seeds of resistance. By the time Harold counted 40 of them, he realized this was no longer his fight alone. It was the neighborhood's. The stage was set. The HOA thought they could control one man, but now they were facing something much bigger. A movement. And like all movements, it started with something small. Something as small as a gnome. The transformation of Harold Carter's yard did not happen overnight, but it grew with such steady persistence that it felt almost supernatural. What began as a quiet rebellion with a single trumpet-blowing gnome soon became a spectacle for the entire block. Every morning, Harold woke to discover 2, sometimes 3, new arrivals. By the end of the second week, his lawn had nearly doubled in ceramic soldiers. 40 gnomes stood shoulder to shoulder, filling the flower beds, lining the walkway, and even crouching near the mailbox like sentinels. At first, Harold thought it might be a prank pulled by neighborhood kids, but when he looked closer, the craftsmanship of the new gnomes told a different story. They weren't dollar store figurines. Some were hand-painted, glazed with bright colors that gleamed under the Georgia sun. Others carried props: a watering can, a book, a barbecue grill, that mirrored the lives of the very neighbors who walked by in secret admiration. One even bore the likeness of Harold himself, holding a tiny ceramic envelope as though still delivering mail. The HOA, however, had no admiration. By the third week, the association board convened an emergency meeting. Their letterheads now screamed in bold font: "Violation escalation. Legal action imminent." They warned Harold that his daily fines would reach astronomical numbers if the gnomes weren't removed. But the warnings did little good. Each threat they issued only seemed to inspire more additions to the growing army. It wasn't long before Harold realized that the gnomes weren't appearing by accident. They were a statement. His neighbors were speaking, not through petitions or angry protests, but through tiny ceramic warriors. Families who had once kept their heads down were now sneaking gnomes into his yard like rebels planting flags on enemy soil. The effect on the neighborhood was electric. Children begged their parents to visit Harold's house after school just to count how many new gnomes had arrived. Couples on evening walks paused to take pictures, laughing at the sheer absurdity of the scene. And though no one admitted it openly, there was a quiet satisfaction in watching the HOA squirm. For years, the HOA had ruled with an iron fist, nitpicking everything from the length of hedges to the shade of curtains visible from the street. But now, their authority was being undermined not by angry shouting, but by an ever-growing collection of smiling stone faces. By the time the local news station caught wind of the spectacle, Harold's front yard had become a landmark. A reporter in a bright blue blazer stood on the curb one Saturday morning, filming a segment titled, "The Gnome War, Community Divided Over HOA Rules." Cameras zoomed in on the gnomes, now over 60 strong, as neighbors walked past, trying to suppress their laughter. Harold stood in the background, arms crossed, refusing interviews but secretly enjoying every second. What the HOA had intended as a punishment was quickly spiraling out of control. Instead of submission, they had created resistance. Instead of silence, they had drawn attention. And instead of discouraging the neighborhood, they had given it a rallying cry. The tension grew sharper with each passing week. One morning, Harold awoke to find not just more gnomes but also little signs staked into his lawn, painted with words like, "Let us stay," and "Gnome, sweet gnome." Someone had even left a small spotlight, illuminating the army through the night like a stage performance. The HOA doubled down. They mailed certified letters. They threatened lawsuits. They even sent a hired landscaping crew to inspect Harold's yard. But the sight of grown men in reflective vests standing awkwardly among dozens of ceramic gnomes only made the story funnier. By now, videos of Harold's lawn were going viral online, drawing comments from people across the country. Some called him a hero. Others declared it the most American protest they'd ever seen. Still, not everyone was amused. A few neighbors, particularly those serving on the HOA board, complained bitterly about the traffic of cars slowing down to gawk at the gnomes. They grumbled about the noise of laughter, the disruption of their peaceful street. One board member, Mrs. Whitaker, was especially furious. She lived 3 houses down and had long prided herself on her pristine front yard with its white rose bushes trimmed like military formations. To her, the gnome invasion was an insult to order, a stain on the community's reputation. Mrs. Whitaker began patrolling the street in the evenings, scribbling notes on a clipboard as though documenting enemy movements. But no matter how many late-night watches she held, she never caught anyone in the act. The gnomes always appeared silently, as though dropped by shadows that vanished before dawn. Meanwhile, Harold's resolve hardened. Where at first he had worried about the fines, now he saw the gnomes as symbols of something much greater. It wasn't just about his right to decorate his yard, it was about everyone's right to have a little individuality, a little joy, without being crushed by endless rules. The neighborhood, especially the black families who had often felt unfairly targeted by the HOA's nitpicking, began to see the gnomes as a quiet rebellion against years of control. By the time the gnome count reached 100, the HOA's threats had become almost comical. Each letter sounded more desperate than the last, filled with legal jargon but no real bite. They wanted Harold to surrender, but the battle had already grown far beyond him. The entire community had joined, even those who had never spoken to Harold before. It was no longer Harold versus the HOA. It was the neighborhood versus the system. And while the HOA tried to bury the fire, the gnomes only fanned the flames. The gnome invasion was no longer a neighborhood curiosity. By the time the 3rd month rolled around, Harold Carter's front yard had become a phenomenon. What had started as 40 gnomes had now multiplied into nearly 200, each one more eccentric than the last. They stood in lines, sat on benches, dangled from tree branches, and even rode tiny toy cars up the driveway. The effect was surreal, like stepping into a miniature carnival frozen in ceramic stillness. And the world had noticed. Local news crews had given way to regional broadcasters, and soon national media descended on the quiet Georgia cul-de-sac. Journalists set up cameras outside Harold's house, snapping photos of gnomes that looked like miniature parodies of HOA board members. Bloggers wrote think pieces about the Great Gnome Rebellion, while late-night comedians slipped Harold's story into their monologues. It was absurd, it was hilarious, and it carried just enough bite to sting anyone who had ever been smothered by rules. For Harold, the sudden attention was dizzying. He was a retired mail carrier who had lived a quiet life, his days spent tending roses and listening to blues records. Now he was the unwilling face of a movement he had not planned but had come to embrace. He never spoke on camera, but his silent stance, folded arms, stern expression, standing in front of hundreds of smiling gnomes, was more powerful than any speech. The neighborhood was divided. Many residents cheered the spectacle, delighted that their sleepy block had become famous for something whimsical. Children darted around, pointing at their favorite gnomes, while parents laughed at the creativity. Some families even began selling homemade gnomes at yard sales, slipping them onto Harold's lawn at night as their secret contribution to the cause. But for the HOA, the situation was spiraling into nightmare territory. Their reputation was crumbling in public view. Every fine they issued, every threat they mailed, was mocked online. When the board president tried to speak to a local paper, his words were drowned out by the photos splashed across the front page. A gnome painted to look like him, complete with glasses, suit, and a miniature clipboard. The internet dubbed him Gnome Whitaker and turned him into a meme. The more the HOA fought, the more ridiculous they looked. And yet they refused to give in. Letters continued to arrive at Harold's mailbox, stacked high with escalating threats of legal action. They accused him of violating community aesthetics, of encouraging vandalism, of destroying neighborhood unity. But the language was dry, bureaucratic, and powerless against the sheer absurdity of 200 tiny statues smirking back at them. By this point, Harold was no longer alone. His neighbors, especially the black families who had often felt unfairly scrutinized by HOA enforcement, began to openly defy the rules as well. Lawns sprouted colorful birdhouses, bold flower beds, and even murals painted on garage doors. What the HOA had tried to suppress had now become a full-fledged cultural rebellion. And the gnomes stood at the center of it all. Tourists began arriving from nearby towns, taking photos in front of Harold's house as though it were a roadside attraction. Some even brought their own gnomes as offerings, leaving them on the porch like gifts at a shrine. Street vendors showed up selling ice cream and trinkets, turning the cul-de-sac into an impromptu festival every weekend. The HOA was furious. To them, this was chaos. Lawns were supposed to be trimmed, sidewalks clear, colors muted and tasteful. Instead, the neighborhood looked alive, buzzing with laughter, conversation, and art. It wasn't disorder, but to the HOA, anything beyond conformity was rebellion. One evening, Harold stood at his window, watching as car headlights crawled down the street, stopping so passengers could lean out and snap photos. The gnomes glowed eerily under the solar lights neighbors had installed, their painted smiles reflecting back at him like 1,000 little victories. For the first time in years, Harold felt that the community truly belonged to its people, not to a handful of rule makers. But tension brewed beneath the joy. The HOA was plotting. Harold knew it. Mrs. Whitaker, the fiercest of the board members, had been spotted pacing outside his house at odd hours, jotting notes on her clipboard. She glared at the gnomes as though they were living enemies. More troubling were the whispers Harold overheard. Talk of the HOA hiring attorneys, talk of restraining orders, talk of taking the matter to court. It didn't matter that the rest of the world found the gnome saga hilarious. For the HOA, it was war. The next morning, a new letter arrived. Unlike the previous notices, this one was stamped urgent, final warning. It declared Harold in violation of over a dozen bylaws, threatened fines totaling thousands of dollars, and demanded the immediate removal of every gnome within 72 hours. The neighborhood waited anxiously to see what Harold would do. Would he give in, crushed by the sheer weight of financial ruin? Would he hire an attorney and fight back in court? Or would he dig his heels in and let the standoff escalate further? Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he spent that evening walking among the gnomes, studying each painted face under the fading light. Some were comical, others solemn, and many absurd, but together they were more than decorations. They were symbols of defiance, of joy, of freedom in the face of oppression. The HOA wanted silence. The gnomes gave laughter. The HOA wanted conformity. The gnomes gave creativity. And Harold knew in his heart, he couldn't back down. The deadline loomed, and the neighborhood buzzed with rumors of what would happen. Cars slowed to read the posted notice taped to Harold's fence. Journalists speculated about whether the standoff would end in court or escalate into something even bigger. And Mrs. Whitaker, clipboard in hand, marched with grim determination, convinced that victory was within reach. But Harold had already made up his mind. If the HOA thought the gnome army had reached its peak, they were about to be proven wrong. Because Harold had a plan. And the gnomes were only the beginning. The 72-hour deadline passed like a storm cloud drifting closer, heavy and impossible to ignore. Neighbors whispered about it on porches, cars slowed at Harold Carter's home to snap photos, and even the evening news set up cameras at the end of the street to wait for the moment of reckoning. The HOA had promised action, and Harold knew they wouldn't let the deadline expire quietly. By that point, Harold's lawn had transformed into something far larger than a quirky display. Nearly 300 gnomes now occupied the yard, each one arranged in deliberate patterns that turned the garden into a kind of living art installation. Some stood in soldier-like rows, others lounged in hammocks, and a few were positioned on ladders as though repairing the roof. The newest arrivals were more intricate than ever, hand-painted gnomes that resembled local figures, national celebrities, and most daringly, caricatures of HOA members themselves. The most infamous edition appeared the morning before the deadline, a towering, 6-foot fiberglass gnome that Harold's nephew had delivered in the dead of night. Painted in vibrant red and green, its broad smile and outstretched arms dominated the yard like a mascot declaring victory. The neighbors nicknamed it Big G, and it instantly became a tourist magnet. Cars lined up to see it, and children posed for photos at its feet as though it were a monument. For Harold, the giant gnome was more than a decoration. It was a declaration of intent. He would not yield. The HOA, however, saw it as a direct insult. Mrs. Whitaker and her fellow board members gathered at the clubhouse that evening, pacing the carpeted floors like generals preparing for battle. They had brought in a property attorney who explained the process of securing a court order to remove the gnomes. To the board, this was about restoring order, preserving dignity, and reasserting their control over the neighborhood. To everyone else, it was about crushing joy under the weight of bureaucracy. On the morning of the deadline, the neighborhood woke with tension buzzing in the air. Journalists filled the sidewalks, holding microphones and cameras at the ready. Families lingered outside, pretending to water lawns or walk dogs, but their eyes stayed fixed on Harold's yard. Everyone was waiting to see whether the HOA would make good on its threats. Harold rose early, dressed neatly in a pressed shirt and slacks, and stepped onto his porch with deliberate calm. His posture was firm, his face serious. Though he had never asked for attention, he understood the gravity of the moment. He wasn't just standing for his own right to decorate his yard. He was standing for everyone who had ever been told to shrink themselves to fit someone else's mold. The gnomes stood with him, an army of painted allies staring defiantly at the HOA. At exactly 10 a.m., Mrs. Whitaker arrived with 2 other board members, each clutching clipboards and official-looking envelopes. They marched down the sidewalk, their expressions tight, their shoes clicking against the pavement. They did not look left or right, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the murmurs of the crowd. They went straight to Harold's front gate, where they stood staring at the gnome army as if confronting an enemy line. The letter they carried was a final enforcement notice, declaring Harold in violation of numerous bylaws and informing him that fines would accrue at a rate of $500 per day until the gnomes were removed. The letter also threatened legal proceedings, including the possibility of placing a lien on Harold's home. Mrs. Whitaker read the notice aloud in a trembling but resolute voice, her words echoing across the hushed street. Cameras captured every syllable, every glance, every tightening of Harold's jaw as he listened. When she finished, she held out the letter with a pointed hand. Harold did not reach for it. He simply stood, arms folded, his face carved into quiet defiance. Behind him, the gnomes gleamed in the morning light, their painted smiles mocking the gravity of the moment. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, broken only by the clicking of camera shutters and the low murmur of reporters whispering into microphones. Finally, Mrs. Whitaker placed the letter on the porch railing and turned away, her jaw clenched. The board members followed her lead, retreating with clipped steps back to the clubhouse. The deadline had come, the notice had been delivered, and the battle had officially shifted from the yard to the courtroom. But Harold knew the fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. That evening, the neighborhood gathered in support. Dozens of families brought lawn chairs and coolers, turning Harold's yard into a block party. Children darted between gnomes, neighbors grilled hot dogs, and music played from portable speakers. What the HOA had tried to crush had blossomed into celebration, unity, and rebellion. The air was thick with laughter and conversation, but beneath it all was a current of determination. No one wanted Harold to stand alone. The media, too, seized the moment. Interviews with neighbors aired across the country, each one framing the battle as a clash between joy and oppression, creativity and conformity. Harold became a symbol, an unassuming retiree whose only crime had been filling his yard with whimsical statues. And the more people saw, the more they took his side. But Harold also felt the weight of what lay ahead. Court battles were expensive. The HOA had resources, attorneys, and bylaws on their side. He had a lawn full of gnomes and the goodwill of neighbors. Was that enough? As the block party stretched into the night, Harold wandered among the gnomes with a lantern, pausing at each one as though drawing strength from their painted expressions. He knew the HOA would escalate, that they would not let public humiliation be the final chapter. He also knew that backing down would set a precedent, that every homeowner would once again live in fear of the board's power. So Harold made a vow to himself under the starlight, his hand resting on the foot of Big G, the towering mascot of the rebellion. No matter what the HOA threw at him, he would not give in. The gnomes would stand. And if the HOA wanted war, then war they would have. The letter from the HOA had been delivered, the deadline had passed, and the fines were already stacking up. On paper, Harold Carter was outmatched. The HOA had money, attorneys, and bylaws written in black and white. But what they didn't have was the neighborhood, the cameras, or the court of public opinion. And by now, Harold's quiet street had become a stage where the entire country was watching. The first summons arrived 2 weeks later, a notice to appear in county court for violation of community covenants. For the HOA, this was their moment to crush Harold with legal authority. For Harold, it was a chance to show the world exactly how far the board was willing to go over a few painted gnomes. In the days leading up to the court date, Harold's house transformed once again. News vans camped on the street, reporters knocked daily, and neighbors brought food and coffee just to show support. Each night, more gnomes mysteriously appeared on lawns across the community. What had started as Harold's personal protest was now a full-blown movement. By the morning of the hearing, the neighborhood looked less like a subdivision and more like a carnival. Lawns were dotted with gnomes holding signs that read, "Free the gnomes, let them stand," and "HOA equals humorless old army." The HOA board members drove past with their heads down, grim expressions on their faces, while families waved and cameras rolled. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was no less electric. Harold arrived in his best suit, shoulders squared, his face solemn but calm. The gallery filled quickly with supporters, neighbors, activists, and even strangers who had driven from out of town just to see the man who dared defy an HOA. Across the aisle, Mrs. Whitaker and her board sat stiffly, their attorney flipping through thick binders of paperwork. The arguments were as expected. The HOA attorney recited bylaw after bylaw, citing the rules about decorative objects, community uniformity, and unauthorized lawn structures. Each word was delivered with the precision of a scalpel, meant to slice Harold's rebellion into pieces. But Harold's attorney, a young black woman from the community who had volunteered to represent him pro bono, approached the case differently. She didn't just argue about gnomes. She argued about freedom of expression, about the right of homeowners to take joy in their property, about the absurdity of enforcing rules so rigidly that whimsy itself became a crime. She painted a picture not of violation, but of community spirit, the very thing HOAs were supposed to foster. The judge listened carefully, his face neutral but his eyes sharp. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but reporters scribbled furiously, and the gallery hung on every word. When Harold's attorney presented photos of neighbors gathering in celebration, of children laughing among the gnomes, and of how the display had brought the community together instead of dividing it, a low murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Outside, the real trial was already happening. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag Gnome Freedom, hashtag Stand with Harold, hashtag HOVS Gnomes. Videos of the neighborhood block parties went viral. Late-night hosts joked about the Gnome Rebellion. Even national outlets began running segments about the fight, framing it as a clash between creativity and control. For Harold, it was surreal. He had never asked for fame, never wanted cameras at his door, and yet here he was, an ordinary retiree whose backyard had sparked a nationwide conversation. His phone rang nonstop with reporters, activists, and even artists asking if they could contribute their own gnomes to the cause. The HOA, meanwhile, doubled down. They issued press releases about maintaining community standards, portraying Harold as a rogue homeowner threatening property values. But each statement only made them look more ridiculous. The more they fought, the more the world laughed. Back in court, the judge did not deliver an immediate ruling. Instead, he ordered both parties into mediation, urging them to find a compromise before he issued a formal judgment. It was a pause in the legal battle, but outside, the movement only grew louder. That evening, Harold returned home to find something astonishing. His lawn had become more than a gathering place. It had become a shrine. Families he had never met left handwritten notes tucked under gnomes. Messages of thanks, encouragement, and solidarity. One card read, "For every gnome they try to take, 10 more will stand." Another simply said, "Keep fighting. You're not alone." Harold walked slowly through the display, lantern in hand, reading each message with quiet reverence. The gnomes, once just whimsical ornaments, now stood as symbols of resistance. They weren't just his anymore. They belonged to everyone who believed in joy, in creativity, in defying rules that crushed individuality. The HOA, of course, was not finished. Behind closed doors, they planned their next move. Rumors swirled of them hiring private investigators to uncover who had been sneaking extra gnomes onto lawns at night. Others whispered about new amendments to the bylaws, emergency measures that would give the board unprecedented power to remove unapproved structures. But Harold knew that no matter what they tried, they couldn't erase the spirit that had already taken root. The gnome army had grown too large, too beloved, and too symbolic. Removing them would mean declaring war not just on Harold, but on an entire neighborhood, and maybe even the country watching from afar. The next court date loomed, and with it, the possibility of a ruling that could reshape the future of the community. But Harold was no longer afraid. He had neighbors at his side, the media on his lawn, and an army of gnomes standing watch. The HOA thought they were fighting to restore order. What they didn't realize was that they were already losing control. And as the neighborhood braced for the next chapter, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about gnomes anymore. It was about power, pride, and the lengths people would go to defend their vision of home. The weeks that followed the first court hearing felt like the calm before a storm. Mediation had been ordered, but neither side showed signs of compromise. The HOA held their position firmly. The gnomes must go. Harold, with his neighbors behind him, was equally unyielding. The gnomes would stand. By now, the movement had taken on a life far beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood. News crews arrived daily, some setting up semi-permanent cameras across the street. Social media remained ablaze with debates, jokes, and memes about the gnome uprising. Tour buses even began stopping by, letting tourists snap photos of Harold's now famous yard. Vendors sold miniature gnomes at the corner, and children from nearby towns begged their parents to bring them to the gnome street. What had started as a quiet rebellion had turned into a cultural spectacle. And the HOA was drowning in the spotlight they had never wanted. The mediation session was held in a neutral office building downtown. The atmosphere inside was icy. Harold sat with his attorney, calm but firm, while Mrs. Whitaker and the HOA's lawyers spread papers across the table like they were preparing for battle. For hours, they argued. The HOA demanded complete removal of all gnomes within the subdivision. Harold countered with a proposal: allow limited decorations within reason, codified into new rules that reflected the neighborhood's diversity and creativity. The talks went nowhere. Each side dug in deeper. The mediator, an older man with thinning hair and weary eyes, rubbed his temples in frustration as the hours dragged on. Finally, he sighed and ended the session, declaring that the case would return to court for a final ruling. It was the decision everyone expected, but it set the stage for a showdown unlike anything the county courthouse had ever seen. On the morning of the trial, the courthouse lawn swelled with people. Protesters carried signs, gnomes decorated with slogans, and banners demanding freedom of expression. Opponents of HOAs in other towns traveled in solidarity, telling stories of their own battles with petty rules. Reporters broadcast live as though it were a high-profile criminal case. Inside, Harold once again faced the board. The HOA attorney presented their case with precision. Bylaws had been violated, and order must be restored. They argued that Harold's gnome army had created chaos, damaged the reputation of the community, and lowered property values. Their words were polished, but they landed flat in a room full of people who had seen the opposite with their own eyes. Harold's attorney rose to speak, her voice steady and powerful. She didn't just argue law. She told a story. She described how the gnomes had united neighbors, how laughter had replaced silence, and how joy had been found in the simplest of ornaments. She showed pictures of families smiling, of strangers gathering in friendship, and of how the once ordinary subdivision had become a symbol of resistance. "Isn't that what community is supposed to be?" she asked, her voice rising. The courtroom was silent but alive, every ear straining to hear her words. The judge retired to chambers for deliberation. Hours passed. The crowd outside grew restless, chanting and singing, turning the courthouse lawn into a festival of defiance. Children played among life-sized inflatable gnomes while vendors sold popcorn and drinks. What should have been a dry legal proceeding had become a cultural event. Finally, the judge returned. His face revealed nothing. As he delivered his ruling, the room hung on every word. He acknowledged the HOA's authority and the validity of their bylaws. Yet he also acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances. The gnomes had gone beyond simple lawn ornaments. They had become symbols of expression, gathering, and protest. The final ruling stunned everyone. The HOA would retain authority to regulate lawn ornaments in the future, but Harold's gnomes would remain. The judge cited their unique role in uniting the community and ruled that removing them would be an act of discrimination against creativity and freedom of expression. The courtroom erupted. Neighbors clapped, some even wept. Harold sat still for a moment, then exhaled slowly, a smile creeping across his face. Across the aisle, Mrs. Whitaker's face flushed red with fury as she whispered sharply to her attorney. But the decision had been made. The gnomes had won. Outside, when Harold emerged from the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and strangers rushed forward to shake his hand. For a moment, he felt less like a retiree from a small neighborhood and more like a figure from history. The gnomes weren't just ornaments anymore. They were a legacy. That night, back in the neighborhood, the celebration reached its peak. Neighbors lined the streets with lanterns, music echoed, and food tables stretched across driveways. At the center of it all was Harold's yard, glowing with lights, where the gnome army stood proudly. Children laughed as they placed new gnomes among the old, each one painted with vibrant colors and personal touches. Harold stood on his porch, watching. He saw the smiles, the joy, the unity that had blossomed from something so small. He thought back to the day he had first placed those gnomes, never imagining how far things would go. The HOA might have tried to erase them, but instead, they had helped them grow into something unstoppable. In time, the gnome story spread even further. Documentaries were filmed. Artists came to paint murals inspired by the movement. Local shops sold Gnome Army merchandise, and the neighborhood was placed on maps as a quirky tourist attraction. The HOA retreated into silence, humiliated but powerless. As for Harold, he never sought to be a hero. He was just a man who wanted a little joy in his yard. But in the end, he became something more. A reminder that sometimes, the smallest acts of defiance can lead to the greatest victories. And so, the gnomes stood tall, not just in Harold's yard, but in the hearts of everyone who believed that individuality, joy, and laughter were worth defending, even against the most rigid rules. The war was over. The gnomes had won. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.